welcome to the Oral History of Criminology project. We're here today in New Orleans at the annual meeting of the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences in 2018. My name is AnnMarie Cordner, and it's my great pleasure to interview Gary Cordner.
It's my great pleasure to be interviewed by AnnMarie Cordner.
So we're going to talk to him about his life and career in criminal justice and criminology. So Gary, could you tell us a little bit about your background?
Okay. I wanted to mention, of course, I'm a native Baltimorean. Grew up in and outside of Baltimore in Maryland. But when it was time for me to go off to school, I ended up going first to Northeastern University in Boston in the early days of their program in criminal justice. And then later, after working in the field for a while, I went to Michigan State University for graduate school, so I became a Spartan. So that's sort of my brief educational background. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit more later if we choose to. A couple times in my career, in between the educational experiences and eventually becoming pretty much a full-time professor type, I did work in the police field. Still identify significantly with the police field professionally.
Okay, so your major works have focused on law enforcement.
They have, yeah.
Okay, good. So I know that you prefer to refer to yourself as a criminal justice researcher rather than a criminologist.
Yeah.
Could you tell us how you got into the field?
Yeah. As I mentioned, I went to Northeastern intending right from the beginning to try to get a bachelor's degree in criminal justice. I don't think, as best I can remember, it was so long ago, that I ever had any particular focus on criminal justice, growing up. And I really think that the number one reason why I both ended up studying criminal justice and the reason I went to Northeastern was as probably a high school junior with no clue what I was going to do. I was in the high school guidance counselor's office and was completely taken by one particular brochure. And it was a brochure for the College of Criminal Justice at Northeastern. And I think probably mostly it showed some people in white lab coats analyzing evidence. So I think I was probably one of the first to fall into the CSI trap, having no clue what it was, of course. So I think that more than anything else led me to study criminal justice. And then this was a long time ago, as mentioned. I'm essentially a child, I'd say, of the 60s, or came of age in the 60s. And it must have been when I was probably in my senior year in high school, when the Chicago Democratic Convention of 1968 took place. And part of what happened at that convention, this was during the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement and so on, there was a lot of protest and a huge division, in the Democrats over who they would nominate to run for president. The mayor of Chicago and the Chicago Police Department got a lot of television coverage crushing demonstrators, behaving very badly. And I think that probably in part intrigued me and sort of got me interested in thinking about policing as a career, like many other people have over the years, from the perspective of, geez, certainly that could be done better.
So when you graduated from Northeastern, you worked as a police officer for a couple of years.
I did, yeah. Northeastern then, and I think still now, is known more than anything else for co-op, cooperative education, and it was a very strong program when I attended. And so what that actually meant was that it took you 5 years instead of 4 to get a bachelor's degree. But throughout those 5 years, you essentially didn't have any summers off. Almost half of the last 4 of the 5 years, you were out working on some kind of a co-op job. And so I had a variety of co-op experiences. My very first one was with the Baltimore Police Department. And my last one was with the Ocean City, Maryland Police Department as a seasonal police officer, a summer cop, if you will. When I graduated from Northeastern, I actually applied to and went through the entire process successfully with the Baltimore Police Department. They, at that time, had what was called a police agent program, and they were aggressively recruiting college grads all over the country. And believe it or not, in today's times, Baltimore Police Department had a very professional, progressive, sort of modern, reputation. And as I said, they were recruiting college grads all over the country. And I applied through that program, got accepted, offered a position, but this was in May, I suppose, graduating from Northeastern. And they didn't have a police academy starting until the following September. Mm-hmm. So they would have put me to work in the police department as some kind of a cadet delivering mail between the precincts. But I had already worked one summer down in Ocean City as a seasonal police officer, not just a cadet. So I said, you know what, I'll go back down to Ocean City for another summer. And then I'll be back in the fall to attend the academy. So I went back to Ocean City and had another great summer. What wouldn't be great about being at the beach in the summer? And they offered me a full-time job. So I ended up staying in Ocean City several years, working as a police officer, and never did end up going to Baltimore PD.
So what took you to graduate school?
So I was working as a cop in Ocean City, and starting to think that I should, already have my bachelor's degree. I started thinking that I should probably start maybe working on a master's. Took a couple of courses locally down there, but there really weren't any schools anywhere nearby that offered any kind of a graduate program, anything related to criminal justice. I think I took 2 or 3 courses in a master's in education. And so I finally decided if I was, definitely wanted to try to pick up a master's degree just to sort of separate me from the crowd, if you will, that I probably had to leave in order to do that. So I'll double back a little bit. The man who became sort of my main mentor back at Northeastern, a fellow named Bob Sheehan, former president of ACJS, back in the very early days of ACJS. Before he went to Northeastern and basically founded the College of Criminal Justice there, he had taught at Michigan State. And he had always told those of us that, that he cared about, when we were getting our undergrad degrees, he'd always told us, if you ever decide to get a graduate degree, you need to go to Michigan State. So when I decided that that's what I needed to do, was probably get a graduate degree, get a master's degree, it was the only place I applied. I mean, I didn't even know there were any other places I could have applied. I was that poorly informed. So I applied to Michigan State and ended up going there. Leaving the police department in Ocean City. I didn't have an official leave of absence. I kind of had an unofficial one that, because my thought at the time was I'd go to Michigan State for a year, get a master's, and then come back, either to Ocean City Police or to some other police department or the FBI or something like that. So I had an unofficial sort of agreement that I could come back. I hadn't burned all my bridges there, although I didn't end up doing that.
No, you completed your doctorate.
I did, and that's, to me, that's, looking back, I'm sort of amazed. I'm pretty sure that when I went to Michigan State with the intent to get a master's, I don't think I had ever even heard of a PhD or heard of a doctorate. I mean, I had never consciously thought about or not thought about getting one. I don't think I even knew what one was. So I was simply trying to get another credential that would maybe put me in a little better position in my police career. And so I got to Michigan State, started taking some classes, and started getting some positive reinforcement, which I never got a whole lot of in my police department. So it sort of dawned on me, geez, I'm being treated well here, it's interesting. And then found out that there was such a thing as a PhD that you could conceivably get after a master's. And so I ended up applying into that and was accepted. and just ended up staying at Michigan State for 4 years instead of the expected one.
Okay. And when you graduated, you started off as an academic, and then you did something unusual.
I did. When I was finishing up, I sort of had it in my mind that it might be interesting to go back into the police world, but there didn't seem like a lot of obvious opportunities for somebody just getting their PhD to go get back in a police department somehow. So I applied to a bunch of academic jobs, and the one that I got offered first and I grabbed was at Washington State University. And I only ended up staying there 1 year. It was a good experience, but it was the other side of the country from everything that I was used to. And then I had an opportunity while I was there to apply and to a position at the University of Baltimore, which of course was my home. Mm-hmm. So I ended up going there for 2.5 years. So altogether I taught 3.5 years as a young assistant professor, hustling, trying to publish and enjoying teaching undergrad and graduate students at both universities. But I also started feeling like maybe I had an itch that I hadn't fully scratched yet, that I hadn't gotten it all out of my system yet. And what I mean by that is the sort of the policing side of the world. And so while I was teaching at the University of Baltimore after a year or two, I did a crazy thing, and I applied to go back to Ocean City as a summer cop. Again, as a seasonal, the way I had started, like 10 years later, and had a really fun summer working as a summer cop in Ocean City. Part of the fun part was I had about 6 of my own students there from the University of Baltimore who were also working there as seasonal cops. So I was sort of the old guy seasonal cop, the professor with his own students. It was kind of bizarre, but enjoyable. But part of what when I did that, it sort of confirmed to me that I still got a lot of enjoyment and satisfaction out of police work. And so at the conclusion of that summer, I let University of Baltimore know that I would be leaving employment with them. I gave them notice, if you will. I didn't leave immediately, but I said, I'm going to start applying around for police positions, and it was kind of a crazy thing, if you will. And I applied to. What I started doing at that point was I was still thinking about the FBI. I was still young enough that I could have gone into the FBI, but I was mainly started applying to police chief jobs. And probably on the young side, and probably on the inexperienced side, for hoping to get a chief's position. But I got lucky, I think purely by chance and just total coincidence, and ended up getting hired as the police chief in St. Michael's, Maryland. So it was still in my home state, sort of the state I understood, at least thought I did. And it was a very small department, but a department that had some issues, so they were looking for somebody to come in and hopefully straighten things out a little bit. So I ended up going back into the police world, long story short, as a chief in St. Michael's. And I did that for 3 years. And it was a very satisfying experience. A lot of positive feedback, felt like we accomplished a lot of things. It was a small department, a small town. But you were able to feel like you were having an impact through your own actions. After I've been doing that for a couple going on 3 years, I started thinking, well, okay, this is pretty small. There's a limit of sort of what you can do in a department of that size. And I also had taken a gigantic pay cut when I took that job. Believe it or not, leaving an assistant professor position to take that chief's job, I took a big pay cut. And so what I actually did at that point was to start looking for chief's jobs in larger places. I started applying around and pretty much got nowhere. And while I was engaged in doing that, looking for a chief's job in a larger place, purely by chance again, I happened to notice an ad for a faculty position at Eastern Kentucky University. And what caught my eye was that it was in a Department of Police Studies, not criminal justice, not criminology, but police studies. I sort of looked into it a little bit. I didn't know anything about the place, and saw that they had, in fact, several faculty members who focused their research and their writing on police, and some of whom had some police experience earlier in their careers. And that was kind of a surprise to me, because every place I'd been up to that point, and most of the places that I knew about, maybe you had one police type. You were the police guy, you taught the police courses. And here was a place with several, and in fact you could get a degree in police studies. Mm-hmm. So that really intrigued me, and so I applied, and lo and behold, got the position. And so even though I was mainly looking for another chief's job, I ended up back in higher ed at Eastern Kentucky, and ended up staying there 21 years. And it was a wonderful experience. I just count my lucky stars that I stumbled into it. There's something funny about these last two positions. That one in Eastern Kentucky, it was actually advertised late. I think I saw the ad in July, and they wanted somebody to start in August. Mm-hmm. And when I applied, of course I was a chief at the time. When I applied, I said I couldn't possibly come in August. I couldn't leave this town in that kind of a lurch. But if someone could start in mid-year, let's say in January, that might be feasible. And Larry Gaines, who was at Eastern Kentucky at the time, basically said, well, yeah, go ahead and apply. We'll see what happens. And so that's how it worked out. Well, lo and behold, the reason they were applying late is they had, during the previous school year, done a search, chosen a guy. He had accepted the position. And so that position had been filled for the upcoming year. And then at the last minute, he had pulled out. I think because his wife didn't want to move to Kentucky. Oh. So the only reason I even saw that job was because somebody else had actually been offered it and turned it down. Now, one of the reasons I bring that up is it's almost the same thing that happened when I got the chief's job. When I got that chief's job at St. Michael's, I was so proud to have gotten it. And later on, I found out that it was like the third time they had advertised it. They had gone through a bunch of applicants. They had chosen, applicants to offer the position to 2 or 3 times, and those people had all turned it down when they found out what the salary actually really was. So the only reason they sort of ended up with me was because they were scraping the bottom of the barrel, and everybody else had already turned it down.
Although, if I recall correctly, they were rather proud to have a police chief with a PhD.
It was an oddity. Again, small town. I think part of what made it work, I think it worked, St. Michael's had 5 elected town commissioners, 2 of whom were retired college professors. One of them was a retired dean from Rutgers, and one of them was like a retired professor of agricultural economics from the University of Illinois or something like that. And so somebody having a PhD didn't sound quite as crazy, I suspect, to them as it might have to the typical town council.
Right, so all of these experiences put you in a fairly unique position in that you have your feet in both worlds.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little more about that?
And I think that's how I've always looked at myself through my professional career, especially once I got into higher ed and then went back into policing and sort of back and forth in a way. I've looked at myself as having a foot in both worlds. I think that's to some extent the way others have seen me, in our field. Of course, the truth is there are a lot, even back when I was coming up, there were a lot of former police who had become professors. So it's not like it was that much of an oddity. I think the fact that I've been a police officer and also a police chief, made me seem a little bit different than some of the others who are otherwise similar to me in criminal justice education. But then during my higher education career, which really I ended up 31 years in higher ed altogether, I always tried to keep a foot in the police world. Not, once after I got to Eastern Kentucky, and from then on, I was never again an active police officer. but I was tried to stay active in police professional associations like PERF and IACP and others. I tried to engage myself as much as I could in police training as well as higher education, and just tried to keep close track of what was going on in the police world, both through my own research and through my writing, and just being around. And so, I think I, was able to position myself as somebody who a lot of people in the police world knew sort of who I was, that guy, in higher ed that knew something about them. And I think maybe also a lot of people in the higher ed world, in the criminal justice world, thought of me as one of those police types that, as you said, had a foot in both worlds. And that's always been very satisfying for me. I didn't just do it because I thought, strategically it would work somehow. It was my inclination to do it because both worlds appealed to me.
And how does that relate back to your preference for being referred to as a criminal justice researcher?
Yeah. Well, I have no degrees in criminology. I institutionally, as a professor, a faculty member, I always associated myself more with ACJS than with ASC. I've always been a member of both, of course, and attended both conferences as often as I could. But I think my own self-image, corresponded more to the way I think of ACJS than ASC. And again, all my degrees were in criminal justice, not criminology. You and I have had many debates. You see criminology and criminal justice as essentially the same thing, or very close. I see them as a little bit more different than you do, and I'm sure you're correct, not me. But my own research, my own writing, has never been about crime, particularly. It's been focused on police, so it's been focused a little bit more on an institution of criminal justice, a part of the network of criminal justice organizations. So I think, for those reasons, I've always thought of myself more as a criminal justice person than a criminologist.
Okay. Well, let's talk about your work a little bit. Does it revolve around a single theme, multiple themes? How would you characterize
it? I'd say my original focus in terms of writing and research was primarily focused on organizationally, and really, in essence, in what would years ago have been called the area would have been called police administration. And I was, totally fortunate. As an undergrad, that mentor that I mentioned earlier, Bob Sheehan, a professor at Northeastern University, invited me to help him write a textbook on police administration. It took several years to complete, so it was several years into my career when we completed the first edition of that book. But his focus was very much police administration. I very much learned at his knee, and some of I'd say most of the earliest writing that I did was focused on police organizations, police personnel, police administration. So I'd say that was my early focus. And maybe I haven't maintained that quite as strongly over the years, partly because this kind of sort of went out of vogue. Mm-hmm. The world of police research moved on to other themes and other topics, and I think I probably followed the field a little bit in that regard. But that textbook is now in its 9th edition. There aren't too many police administration textbooks anymore because there aren't too many police administration courses anymore. It used to be a standard course, this degree, and no longer is it in most places. But I'm proud that I've been able to keep the book going, if nothing else, to honor his legacy. So I started out mostly focused on police administration, like I say, and then at Michigan State, going through graduate school, especially the PhD program, That certainly developed my sort of empirical social science skills. And that was really a big focus of the coursework that I took at Michigan State, on advice of a professor there, Terry Dunworth, who basically said you can read books about criminology and criminal justice, but you're probably not going to read a book about econometrics and understand it. So I want you to take this econometrics course. So I ended up taking a lot of methods and statistics courses at MSU, and tried to use those skills early in my career, because that corresponded to the period, I'd say, in the police academic or police research world, when attention started to be focused more on sort of what works. You know, the whole stream of studies that followed from the Kansas City preventive patrol experiment, and just to identify, well, what are those strategies and tactics and programs that police use, and then how well do they actually work. And you know, that's a matter of evaluation and of using social science research methods to tease out some of those answers to some of those questions. So I did you know, a number of studies sort of in that vein, and have continued to do some, but for a while that was probably my main vein of research. And then I think I just again, following the developments in the field and writing about things that were going on that struck me as interesting, I got, you know, pretty significantly involved with community policing and problem-oriented policing. And at this point, I mean, you know, if I look at the, you know, the citation index stuff, which none of us should look at, but it's some of my community policing stuff that gets cited the most. And a lot of it is not empirical. It's just more of some things that I've written that have tried to describe the phenomenon. Really just say, this is what I think is going on. I think these are the characteristics of what people, you know, what's going on, or what people are trying to do, or what people are saying they're going to do, even whether they do it or not, of course, separate question. And I was lucky enough, related to the community policing stuff, to get involved with, first with PERF and then with the Center for Problem-Oriented Policing, on their annual conferences on problem-oriented policing, and be one of the judges of the Herman Goldstein Award for outstanding problem-oriented policing. And that has kept me, I think, pretty well engaged in that world, problem-oriented policing, which overlaps, of course, a great deal with community policing, but it's not exactly the same thing. And that's probably where most of my work has gone the last 15 or 20 years.
You made a lot of contributions in the field. You co-founded the police section, you've edited journals, you've served as president of ACJS. A lot of your students have gone on to very nice careers. You've published a lot. Of all the things that you've done, what's the thing that means the most to you?
That's a big question. I will say that the textbook that's still in print, 9th edition, the publishers are hounding me to get ready to start working on the 10th edition. That's what publishers do. I'm very proud of that, in part because, you know, it's almost been a life's work. There's so many editions, and because it started with Bob Sheehan. You know, if I could go on a slight segue, I think I mentioned earlier that I ended up at Northeastern and maybe ended up in criminal justice, largely because of that one brochure that I just accidentally looked at in my high school guidance counselor's office, that lured me up there in Northeastern. Well, lo and behold, I found out years later, Bob Sheehan had designed that brochure. So unbeknownst to him or me, he got me up there in the first place, and then he largely became my mentor. And if I could just expound on that a little bit, one of the ways that he had a big impact on me personally was, I remember taking a class from him, and I probably took 3, 4, 5 classes from him, over the course of 5 years at Northeastern. But I remember taking one particular class, and it was a very loosely structured class. And this was in the early 70s, part of the way that he structured the class was that in the end, we graded ourselves. And he gave us the grade that we felt we deserved in the class. And so, of course, I gave myself an A.
Who wouldn't?
Who wouldn't? I'm pretty sure everybody else in the class did too. And I think, and Bob was a devout Catholic, which I'm not, but I'm pretty sure he was probably counting on guilt. And I know in my own case, I knew darn well in that class I hadn't deserved that A. And I really think more than anything else, and that must have been early in my career at Northeastern, I think it got my attention, that taking these classes and getting this college degree was not just about going through the motions. It was not just about figuring out how to play the system and beat the system, but there was something a little bit more intentional and substantive that was supposed to take place. And I really think for me, that threw a switch. And from that point forward, I was much more focused on learning everything that I could learn out of every class that I took, which I don't think I was up until that point. So I think he personally caused me to sort of make a shift, and for all I know, it was a coincidence. Maybe that was just a time in my life, like everybody has a time in their life when it's, it's time to grow up. Maybe that it was just that time, but I think he got my attention that way. And then, of course, again, then he invited me to work on that book with him, and so he just had a lasting impact on me. While he spent a lot of years in higher education, he was a guy who mostly was focused on the police world. And while he taught classes and tried to mentor young students and whatnot, he was also in Massachusetts. He was the guy who would come in and do studies of police departments and end up pointing out all the things that they not only could but should be doing better. And not because he was an efficiency expert, but because there are people's lives at stake, and people's well-being, and people deserve good service. And so I think he was, in essence, I think, a reformer, with a job in the university. I think eventually I settled, that's part of what I settled into as well. Not really a reformer, but feeling like my role in life was as much to try to improve policing as it was to generate knowledge or fill young minds full of useless information. So I feel like I got off on a tangent from what you were asking me, but I wanted to go back and mention that about Bob.
Okay. Well, let's explore that a little further, because he clearly had a huge impact on you. When you worked with students, did you try to emulate him, or did you develop your own approach?
I think my personality is nothing like Bob's was. So I don't think probably I have been anywhere near as good at having that kind of an impact on young people as he did. I think my approach as a professor, a teacher, an advisor, a mentor, I've probably tended to be much more reserved than he was, and to sort of, just sort of focus more on the cognitive and a little bit less on the moral, just because that's, I think, it's just not, I don't think, it's not in my wheelhouse to be Bob. As much as I admire, obviously, the kind of impact that he was able to have.
Okay. Well, let's go back then to the original question, which was, what's the contribution that made you the most proud?
Yeah. I don't think I probably have one good answer for you, for which I apologize. I am proud of the work that we did at EKU. We haven't really said too much about that. I went there as I may have started as an associate professor. I'm trying to remember, because I only had a few years in. I might have come in as an associate, but I ended up being at Eastern Kentucky 21 years. For 5.5 years, toward the end of that time, but not right to the end, I actually ended up serving as dean their College of Justice and Safety, and came into that dean position when the previous dean needed to retire. This is another one of those pure chance things, coincidence. The previous dean, Truett Ricks, who had been dean for a good long while, had to retire for reasons of his pension, and they did a big national search and had some finalists and interviewed them all, and they all fell through. And so basically they came to me. I hadn't applied or anything, hadn't even thought about applying. And in fact, I think all the candidates were from elsewhere. But they asked me eventually if I would be willing to serve as interim dean since the search had fallen through, which is kind of weird because I've never even been a department chair. So, so I went from professor to dean, skipping the in-between level, which I kind of, to me, it's kind of similar to what happened to me in policing. I went from being a patrol officer in one department, and then years later became chief in another. I was never a sergeant or a lieutenant or a captain or anything else. I'm big on skipping steps, and probably a lot of things I didn't learn, in the meantime that I should have to bring with me. But anyway, I became dean at EKU, and I was dean for 5.5 years. I'd like to say that I left on my own terms. I think I was dean under either 3 or 4 presidents, 3 or 4 provosts, so it was a kind of a transitional and a little bit of a tumultuous time at the university. And we came through it unscathed, not mainly, I don't think, my doing, but that of my predecessors and the tremendous faculty that we had. But we were all through almost that entire period, I'd say, we were sort of the one part of the university that people would point to and say they're doing it the right way. They've got their act together. They're good. They have a bit of a national reputation. They serve the community as well as do really, really good academic work. And they'd sort of turn to other parts of the university and say, why can't you be like them? So it was an ideal situation to be in. Early in my tenure as dean, the Commonwealth of Kentucky, the state, announced a new higher education initiative, which was called Programs of Distinction. And what the state said was that each and every one of the state universities can't be graded everything, but each of the universities ought to have at least something, at least one thing that they really stand out for, that they're known for far and wide. And so each of the universities were invited to apply for this funding. And so each university had to come up with a proposal for a program of distinction. There was not enough money to guarantee that everybody was going to get one, so it was competitive. You could apply, if I'm remembering correctly, you could apply for up to, I could be wrong on my numbers, but I'm thinking it was 1.8 million per year that you would get from the state to implement the things that you had proposed to do under your program of distinction. It would be an ongoing initiative, not a one-time deal. And a real sort of a tricky part of it was any of the universities, if they applied, could only apply for as much of the state money, up to 1.8 million, as the university was willing to match with real dollars, not funny soft match, not real estate and desks and chairs, but actual cash. And so, long story short, EKU chose our college to be the one to apply for this program of distinction to the state. And luckily, we'd had a real penny pinching president up until that point for a good while. And so he had a bunch of money in the bank. So we were able to apply for the maximum amount because he had enough to match it. And we applied and we were successful. And so we got this very significant infusion of dollars, real dollars, not just moving stuff around, but real new dollars, half from the state, half from the university. And as far as I'm aware, that continues to this day, which means it's been going on for something like 20 years. And we were very careful in our proposal to not just say we would create a whole bunch of positions that would then suck up all the money. We did create a very small number of new positions, but we, I think we're fairly strategic about talking about how we would use the money to increase our service to the Commonwealth of Kentucky, to increase our things like scholarships, of course, and better technology within the college. Also increase our outreach nationally and internationally to try to, have a bigger footprint than we had at that point, or if you will, around the world. And anyway, long story short, we got the money. We didn't spend it all because we didn't create a whole bunch of positions, which is pretty much what you almost had to do to spend all that money that quickly. And we were able to convince the university that whatever funds we didn't spend were put in escrow for the college. Mm-hmm. And so when I left as dean, we had done a bunch of stuff. I thought, actually, it's when I stepped down as dean to go back to being a professor. We had done a bunch of stuff, and we had a really nice bank account to continue to be able to do things. I mentioned international. We started recruiting international graduate students, which were very successful when we got them, and the faculty that taught them were just extremely pleased about the quality of the students that we were able to bring and how they enriched the classroom and the interaction with the other students and whatnot. It was a huge plus. One of the things we did was create that International Institute that I don't know for sure if it's still there, because we've been gone for a while from EKU, but I think we were successful in getting a little bit of notoriety around the world. Our philosophy there was the world is not going to beat its door to Eastern Kentucky. We weren't exactly Harvard, never mind the University of Maryland or someplace. So we would have to get out and about and knock on doors and meet people and try to convince them that we were a good partner for things that they might be interested in doing. And we were able to put on some international conferences, bring some people in, obviously, things like that I think raised our profile. So that's one of the things I'm proud of, is that I was dean for 5.5 years there. I don't think I blew it. When you get a position like that, one of the things you're most scared of is that you'll ruin something that's already pretty good. And I don't think I blew it. And I think maybe we came out looking pretty good and in good, solid shape, which I think they are still to this day. One of the things during that period that was probably most stressful for me personally, and looking back, it's hilarious. Hilarious is not the right word, but it shouldn't have been stressful, is up until, when I became dean, I guess this would have been I'm thinking about 1998, we were the College of Law Enforcement, and had been the College of Law Enforcement at Eastern Kentucky for, 20 years or something, and I, as a faculty member, had always regarded that name as anachronistic, and also just a poor description of what went on in the college, because the college pretty much always had criminal justice, as I mentioned earlier, police studies, but also you could get a degree in correctional services, you could get a degree in fire and safety engineering, you could get a degree in loss prevention and safety, security type stuff, security and safety. So the college had always been, or at least since its very early days, much more than just police, never mind that it was called law enforcement, which to me is not even a satisfactory label for police. Mm-hmm. So we began to entertain the idea of changing the name, to something that was more modern, that would sound better to the rest of the country. And it's hard to come up with a good name. I mean, the colleagues, with a background like my own would immediately think, well, College of Criminal Justice, or Criminal Justice and Criminology. Except the college had components that had nothing to do with that, like fire and safety engineering, etc. So we felt like we needed a different name, but there were no existing different names that I could think of that were a good description. And of course, you didn't wind up with the name of a college that was about seven words long either, because then people would just shorten it anyway. So long story short, we ended up converging on College of Justice and Safety, thinking that justice captured the criminal justice, the criminology, the corrections, the police, and safety captured safety, security, fire, etc. We kind of thought those were the two best words, justice and safety. And I mean, looking back on it, I still think that was a good choice. I mean, I think they are, in some ways, not exactly two sides of a coin, but the two major components, you know, of certainly what the programs in that college aspire to do for society. So we settled on that name, and then I panicked. Because I got to thinking that I was going to be the dean that caused a change in the name of the College of Law Enforcement, which was a big name in Kentucky. Everybody in Kentucky knew about the College of Law Enforcement at EKU, and I was going to be the guy that changed the name. It's like we had a working brand, and I was going to be the guy that changed it. And at the last minute, I panicked. And fortunately, some other people, you know, calmed me down and convinced me that it would probably be okay. And so we did go through with the name change. And naturally, there were a few sort of old-timers, you know, who thought, oh, geez, you've ruined it. And I'm pretty sure about, you know, 2 hours later, everything was fine, and everything was dandy, and it went very well. So that's one thing I'm proud of. You mentioned the journals. I don't mean to go on and on, but let me mention that I became the editor of the American Journal of Police. I'm not sure when. This would have probably been the early 90s or something like that, maybe late 80s, I don't know. And was editor of that for I think 5 years. It was a good solid journal. We're talking a long time ago. And then I turned the editorship over to somebody else after having, you know, done a full term. Well, not long after I turned the editorship over, and no fault of the editor, the publishing company that published the American Journal of Police, in essence, they owned it, and also owned a journal at the time called Police Studies, which was really pretty much run out of John Jay College, and had been around for a long time. The same publishing company owned both of those, and they combined them and sold them to, I'm not exactly sure, it might be Routledge, what is now Routledge, Taylor and Francis, but anyway, they sold them, in my mind, they sold them to a British company. So they took the only two American police journals that existed at that point and sold them to a foreign company. And I was just so incensed, especially having been the editor of American Journal of Police and feeling like, you know, we were making it into something at that point. And so I started scheming, and within a couple of years, another fellow, Dennis Kinney, who then worked for Perf, is an academic guy, teaches at John Jay now. Dennis and I convinced Perf to start a new journal, an American, you know, a journal in America, a new police journal, and that was Police Quarterly. And I was the initial founding editor of Police Quarterly, and I edited that for 5 years. Perf was literally the publisher of Police Quarterly for I think about the first 2 issues, not years, but issues, and figured out that publishing a journal was not something they wanted to do. And we were lucky enough to get Sage to pick it up. And of course, Sage still publishes Police Quarterly, and I think it's a well-regarded journal to this day. So I published. I was the editor of American Journal of Police, you know. And then they didn't sell it out from under me, but I felt like they sold it out from under the country, you know. And so we started another journal, and very, very proud to have done that and to have edited both of them. And around about the same time as all that is when we started the police section of ACJS. I'll just mention something about that. ACJS, as historians know, was really started by a bunch of police professors. And actually what is now ASC before that was started by a bunch of police professors. We sort of have a history of police professors starting something and then it gets taken over by either people with broader interests and more academic interests in criminology and criminal justice. So as of the early middle 90s, a bunch of us police types within ACJS, I had a bit of a sense that we were getting marginalized again within ACJS. And I'm sure we were psychologically, flawed in some way. I'm sure we shouldn't even have been feeling that way, but we were. We came up with the idea, rather than breaking away like had happened 2 or 3 times before by our police professors that came before us, we had the idea to create a section, sort of our own little bailiwick, our own little thing within ACJS. And the reason this was significant, I think, was it was the first section. ACJS didn't have any sections at that point. It had regions, but it didn't have sections. And there was a long-standing fear that as started allowing the creation of sections, you'd get some kind of balkanization or some kind of fragmentation, and nobody would identify with the whole organization anymore. They'd only identify with their own little piece of it, which obviously I understand. But our counter-argument was we feel lost in this big organization, and having a section is a way of keeping us in the fold, under the tent, and yet we can sort of have a focal point of our own. Mm-hmm. And we were successful. Larry Gaines and I were the main guys, I guess, pounding the drum and making the official proposal and drawing up a constitution and all that to create the police section, which the ACJS board agreed to. Probably in many cases, in many of their minds, reluctantly. And of course now ACJS has a whole bunch of sections. Mm-hmm. And I think the general sense is that sections have invigorated and strengthened ACJS rather than detracted from it. But in any event, we were there at the creation. And of course it's a huge hoot that about 5 years ago, friends of ours created the Division on Policing in ASC. So it took them a while to catch on.
Yeah,
yes. They're a bit slower, I think, on the uptick, but they've done the same thing. And of course, a lot of us belong to both.
Yeah. Let's go back to your international work.
Ah.
The bulk of your work, at least your scholarly work, is focused on the United States.
It has.
But starting while you were still at EKU, in fact, right around the time that the program of distinction was developed, you began becoming interested in international things, an interest that has continued to this day. And the bulk of your work internationally is focused on Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
So I'd like you to talk a little bit about how all that came about.
Right.
And how it fits in with the other work that you do.
Yeah. I think probably when I was a grad student at Michigan State way back in the day, I did a study abroad in England, which of course is not very exotic. It's almost the same language. Almost. Except for all the differences. But even then I can remember that I was quite fascinated with the ways in which policing in England and the U.S. were similar, but also the ways in which they were different. And so I think I've been drawn to it from a standpoint of curiosity or intellectual interest for a long time, but never did anything with it to speak of. But yes, while I was a dean at EKU, and we were trying to develop some sort of international presence, whatever it might be, sort of against all odds, as we talked about. We started traveling and trying to attract graduate students, international students, and that sort of thing. And again, like so many things, more or less by chance, we had a connection who in turn had connections in Russia with several universities. And this was after the Soviet Union had fallen apart. And in fact had a good connection to what was, if I remember correctly, the first private university in Russia. After the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so we traveled there several times. We met with variety of universities in Moscow and St. Petersburg, attracted a good handful of graduate students that came to EKU, as I mentioned earlier. And on those trips, I would always also try to make some kind of connection with the police, not having any idea what would come from it, but just out of curiosity. And then later, while still at EKU, we had some NIJ money related to technology, and we made some connections, again, with Russia, related to sort of law enforcement technologies. Again, this was 20 years ago, so whatever I don't remember what the technologies were, but they're probably antiquated already at this point. But that led us to have some more connections with police in Russia, and then spilling over from that, from those connections, we also had some connections in Ukraine. And so we made some trips there to universities, as well as meeting with some police there. And we would always present ourselves over there as one of the relatively few universities, EKU, relatively few universities in the U.S. that had more than a passing focus on police, within the criminal justice or whatnot. And so we made those connections. Nothing ever too much came out of it, other than I think a fascination with Russia and Ukraine and other parts of Eastern Europe. Those countries are going through such a tremendous transition after the collapse of the wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then probably a lot of that just sort of more or less got put on hold for a while for me, because I didn't have any particular connections after a while, and then this isn't personal, and I'm not sure if this is where you're trying to lead me.
I didn't lead you anywhere.
Yeah, you lead me around by the nose, but of course we adopted our daughter from Ukraine. In what year was that?
2001.
2001. And so about 10 years later, 12 years later, something like that, we were back in Ukraine, taking our daughter back for her first visit to her native country. And again, largely by chance, bumped into some U.S.-funded police reform work going on in Ukraine. A lot of it focused on trying to introduce them and encourage them to think about community policing, problem-oriented policing. Also help them modernize their police training institutions. And what we learned, of course, eventually is that of all the former Soviet republics, Ukraine was one of the ones that had sort of changed the least at that point in time. So I started getting involved in just doing a little bit of work over there, and then Ukraine had its Revolution of Dignity about 3 or 4 years ago now, around what's called the Maidan. And subsequent to that, there's been a huge push to modernize, westernize the country. And as I've had an opportunity to have a hand in that in terms of changes to their police, and it's hugely gratifying, partly because we have the family connection to Ukraine, and also because at this point, several years after their Revolution of Dignity, probably Ukrainians they would point to things that have gotten better. Not everything has. Things that were areas where there have actually been visible change. They probably would point to the police first before almost anything else. And that doesn't mean that they don't still have huge problems and a long way to go. But they've also made some real, honest, genuine changes for the better in the way their police treat people, in the service that the police deliver when people need help and need service. And we've had a hand, not in the U.S., along with Canada and some other countries that really, I think, do deserve some of the credit for helping them go in that direction. So yeah, to me, I do find the international stuff fascinating. Don't know a lot about it. Not trained in comparative or international studies at all. But obviously, I know something about policing. And then to see how it's similar or different in other countries is fascinating to me.
I think it also illustrates, again, a kind of a uniqueness to you, because most people doing work in comparative are doing more academic comparisons rather than being able to actually have a hand in making changes in the country.
Yeah. I think that's probably right. Again, I think I've been lucky that I've had this foot in both worlds, over a long period of time, and it's worked for me both professionally, but it's also been very satisfying.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing throughout our conversation is that maybe one of the major themes or characteristics of your work is that you have a foot in both worlds, and the other one is the role of luck. Because if I recall correctly, you might have met another personal family member through luck and through your work.
Yes, you do recall that correctly. AnnMarie and I met at a regional meeting of the Northeast Criminal Justice Association, NEACJS, Northeast Association of Criminal Justice Sciences, the Northeast region of ACJS. We met at that meeting. At the time, I was ACJS president, and on account of being ACJS president, I was expected to go to the regional meetings, which I didn't really want to do, and I tried to get out of it, I tried to convince the then vice president, or first vice president of ACJS, who would become the president after me. I tried to convince her that she should be the one to go to the regional meetings because she needed to meet all these people and they needed to meet her to help her be a more successful president. And she basically told me to bug her off. I was Donna Hale. And so she made me go, and we met.
We did.
And one thing led to another.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely correct that coincidence has played a big role, almost always positive. Certainly in that case, extremely positive.
Thank you. I certainly hope so. Okay, so before we finish, if you were going to be talking to a young scholar, what would you tell them?
Yeah. And of course, I'm hesitant to think of myself as a scholar, partly because I've had this foot in both worlds. So I sort of almost feel like a sort of a half a scholar, sort of a half a practitioner. And so I'm very hesitant, to give any advice to anybody, needless to say, especially as it usually turns out to be lousy advice. But I can say that what worked for me in my graduate studies, and I mentioned this briefly earlier, and I was lucky because the graduate program that I went through at Michigan State, it was, if you will, it was the criminal justice PhD, except it was a PhD in social science, which is what the MSU degree was up until, I'm not sure, the mid or late 80s or something, when it became literally criminal justice. And so in my case, I had to take a bunch of courses in 2 other social science areas, in addition to the ones in criminal justice, and in addition to the stats and methods that I had to take. And the advice I was given for those other 2 social science areas, which for me were psychology and political science, is don't take a bunch of psych and poli-sci courses. Take their methods and their stats. Again, because if you read a book on it, you probably wouldn't understand it. And so coming out of Michigan State as a young scholar, in my case, I was very well equipped in terms of research methods and statistics. And that was a long time ago. I couldn't pass myself off for that today. But back then I was, especially in my case, somebody who had been a cop. So, I was one of the cop types, but I think I was strong methodologically. And that combination really worked well for me.
Mm-hmm.
Not saying it would work for everybody else, but it worked really well for me. So that's one thing again, it just worked for me. And then the other is I do have a strong feeling, especially in regard to police, but I think it might be even broader to criminal justice. Is that as much, I don't want to say practical experience, but as much genuine familiarity with the worlds that criminal justice practitioners work in, as possible, makes someone who is a faculty member or a scholar in those fields stronger. I'm not one who says you have to have been a cop in order to be a good, teacher of intro to police. I think that argument, which some people make, I think that's way overblown. But I think that to the extent that you haven't just read about whatever the field is, but that you have some experience, direct or indirect, and it can obviously come from observation, not just from literally doing. It simply makes you stronger. It definitely gives you more credibility with the students, who usually don't know any better, so it doesn't take much to fool them. If you just got a little bit, that's usually plenty. And I think in my teaching career, I was probably always able to have a little bit more credibility with those undergrads, having at one point been out working in the field. But also, I've been able to do a lot of teaching of police, not so much in the police academy, but in the executive development, police executive development programs, police management programs. And I think partly I can at least get their attention for a while. They'll listen to me for a while until I say something really stupid, but they'll at least listen for a while because they have a sense that I've lived in their world. And that's, I think, very helpful.
So for those people who haven't worked in the field, do you think that pursuing grants where they would be doing research with people working in the field is a way to obtain some of that credibility? If so, I know that you've successfully pursued a number of grants and received some very large ones.
Yeah.
What would you tell them about how you do that?
Yeah, and I think that is a useful avenue. I think starting out, the best thing to do is to offer to work for free. I think there are lots of people in the police world, for example, police chiefs, police departments, who, if they're approached by a local professor who simply says, I'd like to see if there's anything that I could do that could be helpful to you. And in essence, offer to do some data collection or do some kind of a research project or do some kind of an analysis or something pro bono. It is a way to, this topic came up because it's a way to get some experience or at least some closer observations. But also it's a way to demonstrate that you really care, that you're not just looking for money, that you're not just trying to just trying to make a buck, and it demonstrates sincerity. And so I think that's one good way to get in the door. And a lot of times that will end up leading to contracts and grants. But it's just sort of an investment up front, of your time in order to do that. And obviously it's also a way to build up a trust level. If you do some stuff for them and you do it capably, and they don't read about it first in the newspaper, before they hear about it from you. And not only credibility but also trust, sort of goes in the bank, and they give you more chance to do that kind of work, including ultimately, possibly get a grant or something to do it. It used to be the case, and I'm not sure it's as common now, when sort of I was starting out, it used to be fairly common to have police, even police managers and so on, in your classes. And that would be another way to get to know them and for them to conclude that you weren't, their enemy, that you were genuinely simply curious about things or interested in being of assistance. I don't know that there are as many police practitioners in young professors' classes today as there were 20, 30, 40 years ago.
I think you may be right. I think there are more people looking to get their bachelor's degree before they go to the academy.
Yeah.
Because more police departments are looking for people with degrees.
Yeah. And then even at the graduate level, I'm not sure when I first started out, it just seemed like there would be a lot of people from local police departments trying to pick up their master's degree, part-time in the evening and all that. Mm-hmm. And I'm just not completely sure that's as common as it once was. I could be wrong, but that, again, that was a great way to make connections if you were a young professor.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So is there anything we haven't talked about today that you'd like to tell us?
Lots of things, of course. I think I just mentioned a few people, in addition to, I really probably only maybe dwelled on Bob Sheehan's influence on me. One of my fellow students as an undergrad at Northeastern was Jack Greene. He was 1 year ahead of me in the program at Northeastern. He had actually been in the military for a couple of years, so he was several years older than me. Still is.
Still is.
But he was 1 year ahead of me. So we were basically students together at Northeastern. And he was also, or is, a protege of Bob Sheehan. So Jack and I were a couple of the people that Bob took under his wing. Jack and I have remained fast friends all these years. Jack, when he left Northeastern with his bachelor's, went straight to Michigan State to get to graduate school. Again, I went out and worked for a couple of years, so I got to Michigan State probably 4 years after him. He was already done, or finishing maybe. I think he was finishing his PhD when I first got there. And then he went off for a year and then came back on the faculty. So I've been bouncing around Jack all these years. He's not only been a great friend, but he's also been an inspiration. Also a police scholar. I think also greatly affected by Bob Sheehan. Also, I think someone who's had sort of a foot in both worlds, not in all the same ways that I have, but when everything is said and done, a foot in both worlds. And I admire the work that he's done, and he's been a good role model for me.
At least professionally.
Yeah, at least professionally. That's right. Exactly. Yeah, that would be some of the stories that we wouldn't include
That's right.
on that side. And then I do want to say, and then I'll quit, that a funny story, when I applied to graduate school at Michigan State, I was a cop in Ocean City, applied to graduate school, go to the master's degree, got accepted. The paperwork that they sent me was signed by the director of the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State, Arthur Brandstatter, the director of the graduate program, Vic Strecker. These are big names back in the day. And then my graduate advisor, a professor named Bob Persley. So like 2 months later, I get to Michigan State. All three of them are gone. I was like, geez, what's with this place? What's going on here? And they had simply all moved on. It wasn't actually. There wasn't a scandal. It was just things happened. But when I got to Michigan State, I would want to mention that a professor early on that had a big impact on me was Terry Dunworth. He's the one who really pushed me to take all the methods and stat classes I could, because you can read books about the other stuff, and he was right. Also, when I first got there, Larry Hoover was on the faculty, and he was one of the main police guys, and I bonded with him right away. Um, Learned a lot from him in the classes that I took from him, police classes, but also have stayed connected with him all these years. Larry left Michigan State. Actually, I only had him 1 year, and he went to Sam Houston. And I think he's only just now, maybe he's just now retiring from Sam Houston. Has had a long career down there. And Larry is another one of these guys who was a cop, got his doctorate, and especially at Sam Houston, has, besides being one of the academic leaders in their College of Criminal Justice for decades, has worked intimately with the police departments all throughout Texas. Created the executive development program called Lean It in Texas, which is probably the best state level program in the country. Probably at this point 2 or 3 generations of police leaders and executives that have come through that program from all kind of different police agencies throughout the state of Texas. So Larry's had a huge impact on me. He's given me many opportunities to do things, especially in Texas, and just been an inspiration. I guess I'll leave it there. I'm probably starting to remember.
No, you don't do that.
It's really been an hour and a half.
Probably.
I covered almost half the things on my list.
Good. Covered a few. All right.